I still remember the day I packed my things and left my childhood home as if it were etched in slow motion. College had promised independence, new friends, and late-night study sessions fueled by energy drinks. But leaving meant more than just freedom, meant leaving the familiar rhythm of my mum's house behind. At 20, I thought I had a clear picture of adulthood, and I carried it with a certain pride, like a badge I had earned. My room, my sanctuary for so many years, suddenly felt like a memory preserved in amber. Each poster on the wall, each crooked shelf, each crumpled t-shirt in my drawer whispered stories of a life I was leaving behind. The first year at college was a whirlwind. Dorm rooms felt temporary. Conversations were superficial yet exhilarating, and I thrived on the anonymity and the sense of choice. I didn't realize until later how much of my mother's influence had been woven into my day-to-day life. I didn't have to cook every day or coordinate medical care for anyone. I didn't have to be hyper-aware of routines or the countless tiny details that kept a household running. In hindsight, I suppose I was living in a bubble of independence, untouched by the complexities waiting back home. Then, about 10 months ago, life at my mum's house changed drastically. Her fiancé moved in with his children, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, the latter carrying a heavy weight in her small frame. An array of medical conditions that demanded attention at almost every hour of the day. My mum had anticipated this change for months. She had taken classes, read manuals, and spoken with specialists to prepare herself to care for the girl who had no one else to rely on. Her fiancé's ex had disappeared entirely, leaving my mum to step in, and I understood why she made that choice. When I came back home for Christmas after the move, I noticed the first ripple of adjustment. My old room, once a space that felt endlessly mine, had been given to the 4-year-old. There was no spare room for me, so I stayed with my grandparents. My mum was visibly disappointed, but I tried to explain that my absence would prevent me from inadvertently disrupting their delicate routine. The holiday was strange warm with family memories, but tinged with a quiet acknowledgement that the house I had grown up in no longer belonged solely to my past self. It was the same story when I returned for the summer. I stayed with my grandparents again, even turning down my mum's offer of a pull-out bed. She wanted me close, wanted me involved, and maybe even expected me to assume some responsibilities for her fiancé's daughter. I wasn't ready for that, and I knew it. There was something almost sacred about boundaries. The invisible line that separated my role as her son from the role of a caretaker for someone medically complex. Every conversation about classes or training to help with the 4-year-old underscored this invisible boundary. My mom, in her gentle way, hoped I would step in, at least occasionally. I hoped she understood that I could support her in ways that didn't include direct caregiving. Her fiancé, however, wasn't as understanding. He asked me pointedly if I would ever be willing to stay at the house, if I would consider learning the necessary skills, or if I would remain distant. I answered honestly, I wouldn't take on those responsibilities, and I wouldn't sacrifice my privacy or my peace of mind. My rationale wasn't cruelty, was reality. Being there would benefit no one. I would have limited time with my mum because she would be consumed by routines and caregiving duties. I wanted my visits to be meaningful, not a window into a schedule dominated by medical care. That conversation marked the beginning of a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. My mum's fiancé seemed to interpret my boundaries as a lack of care or a refusal to be involved, while I saw them as necessary self-preservation. I didn't want to step into a role I wasn't trained for, especially given the girl's medical complexities. fragile bones from osteogenesis, and a host of other challenges I barely understood. I had to remind myself repeatedly that refusing didn't make me a bad person. It made me someone who recognized their limits. The adjustment to this new family dynamic was about more than just rooms or schedules. It was about shifting roles, understanding that my childhood home had transformed into a space where love, care, and responsibility were now intertwined in ways I wasn't part of. I missed the simplicity of the family dinners, the casual conversations in the living room, but I also recognized that the house had evolved. My role was no longer central, and I had to learn how to navigate my attachment without overstepping. I also had to confront my own feelings about the children. The 6-year-old boy was lively, charming, and easy to connect with. A reminder that kids could bring joy even in complicated circumstances. The 4-year-old, however, was different. Her condition made her fragile, unpredictable, and deeply dependent on her caregivers. Watching my mum move with practiced precision, anticipating her needs and handling emergencies calmly, was both admirable and intimidating. It was a reminder of the immense responsibility she had taken on voluntarily, a responsibility I wasn't prepared to assume myself. Even in absence, I felt the gravitational pull of their new life. Conversations with my mum were often punctuated by updates on the girl's health, new strategies for therapy, or logistical concerns about appointments. Her fiancé occasionally tried to draw me in, asking if I wanted to learn or help, but I consistently declined. Each refusal was met with quiet disappointment, sometimes masked by politeness, other times more pointed, revealing the tension between intention and expectation. Reflecting on it now, I realized that leaving home didn't just separate me physically. It created a chasm in understanding. My experiences at college had shielded me from the daily grind of medical caregiving, while my mum's life had become intensely focused on it. The contrast was stark, almost jarring. I loved my mum, of course, and I admired her commitment. But I also understood that my path was different, and forcing myself into a role I couldn't sustain would do more harm than good. Even planning visits required careful negotiation. Timing became essential. I needed moments when my mum was less busy, when the household wasn't consumed by routines and crises, so that our time together could be meaningful. I wasn't avoiding her. I was avoiding a scenario where my presence became a logistical burden rather than a source of connection. It was a delicate balance, maintaining intimacy without entangling myself in responsibilities I wasn't equipped to handle. There were moments of guilt, of course. Watching my mum juggle her responsibilities from a distance sometimes made me feel inadequate, selfish even. But each time, I reminded myself that love doesn't always mean stepping directly into every challenge. Supporting her meant visiting thoughtfully, respecting her routines, and offering presence without obligation. It was a lesson in boundaries, patience, and understanding that family could be a source of support without complete immersion. Adjusting to this new reality was ongoing. Each holiday, each summer visit, each fleeting moment at home reinforced the changes that had taken place. The house no longer belonged solely to the past I remembered. It belonged to a blended family, a complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and love that I admired from the sidelines. I was learning, slowly, that presence could take many forms, and that sometimes stepping back was just as important as stepping forward. Returning home in late June, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and hesitation. Summer visits had always carried the promise of extended time with my mum, but this time was different. Her fiancé and his children now occupied the house, and I had to navigate an entirely new dynamic. I stayed with my grandparents again, a decision I made deliberately to preserve everyone's space and routine. My mum offered to buy a pull-out bed for me, which was kind and practical, but I politely declined. The house had changed. My old room had become the 4-year-old sanctuary, and I knew that inserting myself into that space would create more complications than comfort, even before I arrived. There were discussions about whether I would take the same caregiver classes my mum had undertaken. At first, I was slightly amused by the suggestion. The idea of me suddenly stepping into a role I had no experience with seemed unrealistic. When my mum asked if I wanted to be set up with the classes, I explained that I wasn't interested and asked why I'd need them. Her response was gentle, yet hopeful. She had wanted me to learn how to help, at least in emergencies. She wanted the reassurance that I could step in if a crisis arose, and I understood that from her perspective, my willingness mattered. But I knew my limits. The thought of caring for a child with severe medical conditions, seizures, fragile bones, spasms, and other challenges I barely comprehended was daunting. I told her that it would be better to find a professional in case of emergencies rather than putting myself in a situation I couldn't handle safely. Her fiancé, however, interpreted my refusal differently. He asked if I was just never going to stay at the house, and I answered honestly. I said yes, explaining that staying there would strip me of privacy and likely provide little meaningful interaction with my mum. He seemed frustrated, perceiving my boundaries as disinterest or refusal to engage with his family. I tried to clarify. I would see them when I saw my mum, but I wasn't signing up for babysitting or long-term caregiver responsibilities. It was a fine line to walk, being part of family moments without becoming an essential cog in the caregiving machine. One evening, after a tense conversation, my mum and I went for a walk together. The summer air was warm, and the street smelled faintly of cut grass and sun-baked asphalt. She expressed her understanding of my position, but also her hope that I would be willing to help, even occasionally. I know it's a lot to ask, she said, and you don't live that close anymore, so it wouldn't be all the time. But would you really be unwilling to give us a few hours when you visit? It would be so helpful. I appreciated her honesty and her vulnerability, yet I had to stand firm. I reassured her that I would visit and spend meaningful time with her. But stepping into a caregiver role, especially for a medically complex child, was not something I could commit to. She was upset, but she let it go, trusting in my presence in the ways I could offer it. Despite my conversations with my mum, her fiancé held a grudge. He brought up my lack of involvement with the kids to my grandparents when the subject of Christmas visits came up. His annoyance seemed to center on the idea that my staying elsewhere allowed me to avoid forming closer ties with the children or learning how to care for the 4-year-old. It was frustrating. My intention had never been to distance myself from anyone, but rather to navigate boundaries that kept visits manageable and meaningful. Spending time with the 6-year-old boy was easier. He was lively and affectionate, quick to joke and laugh, and his energy was contagious. Interacting with him reminded me of simpler aspects of family life: playful teasing, shared jokes, and spontaneous storytelling. Yet the 4-year-old's presence brought a different weight. I watched my mum attend to her with precision and care, anticipating needs before they arose. Every seizure, precaution, every careful adjustment, every calculated move reinforced the complexity of her life. I admired her immensely, but I also understood why stepping into her shoes was not an option for me. Even simple acts required thought and planning. Mealtimes, Medication schedules, therapy sessions, and rest periods had to be coordinated carefully. Visiting meant observing, sometimes helping in minor ways, but mostly respecting routines. My time with my mum had to be scheduled around these obligations, or risk becoming intrusive. It was a delicate balance, remaining present without overstepping, offering companionship without taking responsibility. During one afternoon at my grandparents' house, my mum checked in with updates. She described new strategies for the 4-year-old, adjustments to her medication, and progress in therapy sessions. Each story highlighted her dedication and the intense demands placed upon her daily. I listened carefully, offering support through conversation and reassurance. But I remained mindful of my decision to stay uninvolved in direct caregiving. The emotional weight of her responsibilities was palpable, and I understood that any misstep on my part could have serious consequences. In quiet moments, I reflected on the changes that had occurred. The home I had grown up in was no longer purely my mum's sanctuary or my childhood haven. It had transformed into a complex ecosystem, a space where love, care, and responsibility were deeply intertwined. My role had shifted. I was no longer the central figure, but rather a supportive presence, observing and connecting on terms that respected everyone's needs. There were moments of subtle tension with her fiancé, who seemed to equate my boundaries with indifference. Yet I knew that setting limits didn't mean withholding affection or care. It meant acknowledging my own capacity and understanding the difference between support and responsibility. My mum understood this. Her fiancé struggled with it. It was a tension that would likely persist, but I had to stay true to my reasoning. Navigating these visits required constant awareness. I had to plan carefully, ensuring that my presence aligned with routines and did not disrupt the household. I had to be conscious of my interactions with the children, particularly the 4-year-old, whose needs demanded sensitivity and expertise I didn't possess. The balance between connection and distance was delicate but necessary. Each visit reinforced my understanding that family involvement could take many forms. I could support my mum without stepping into a caregiver role, and I could maintain bonds without assuming responsibilities beyond my capacity. In retrospect, these summer visits were as much about negotiation as they were about connection. I had to constantly navigate expectations, both spoken and unspoken, while protecting my own boundaries. It was a lesson in empathy, patience, and self-awareness, understanding that love sometimes means being present in ways that are sustainable and appropriate. I left each visit feeling both enriched and challenged, aware of the distance between intention and reality, yet committed to maintaining meaningful relationships on terms that honored everyone involved. The tension with my mum's fiancé was subtle but persistent, lingering like a shadow over family interactions. Even when I tried to keep things light and focused on meaningful moments with my mum, there was an undercurrent of judgment and resentment. He seemed to measure my involvement in caregiving as a reflection of my character, interpreting my boundaries as disinterest or unwillingness to commit. I understood his perspective in a theoretical sense. I was, after all, declining responsibilities that he considered crucial. But in reality, my choices weren't about avoidance. They were about recognizing my own limitations and maintaining boundaries that allowed me to be a supportive son without compromising my well-being. Christmas had become a particularly fraught topic. When the holidays came up in conversation with my grandparents, her fiancé voiced his frustration. He hinted, subtly yet pointedly, that my decision to stay with my grandparents rather than the house meant I was distancing myself from his. children, and refusing to learn how to care for his daughter. I listened quietly, aware that this conversation reflected his perspective more than reality. Staying with my grandparents had never been about avoidance, it had been about preserving meaningful interactions with my mum, protecting my own privacy, and ensuring that my visits didn't interfere with the structured routines the children relied on. Yet the weight of this tension wasn't limited to verbal exchanges. It manifested in glances, in the slight stiffness of conversation, in the unspoken expectations that hovered in the background. I felt the strain between wanting to be a caring part of my mom's life and needing to maintain a healthy distance from responsibilities I wasn't equipped to handle. My mum seemed to understand my reasoning, expressing support and understanding even when the conversation with her fiancé became difficult. Her empathy was unwavering, but the reality of blended family dynamics meant that her fiancé's dissatisfaction was a constant factor I couldn't ignore. Navigating family relationships in this environment required careful consideration. I had to be intentional about how I spent my time, ensuring that my presence was positive and meaningful without overstepping boundaries. Visiting the children meant being aware of their needs, particularly the 4-year-old's medical vulnerabilities. While not taking on responsibilities that required professional training, it was a delicate dance, balancing care, affection, and observation without stepping into roles I wasn't prepared for, despite the tension. There were moments of connection that reminded me of why I chose to maintain my presence in the household on my own terms. My conversations with my mum during walks or quiet evenings at my grandparents' house were filled with honesty, vulnerability, and laughter. We shared memories, discussed future plans, and supported each other through the ongoing challenges of our respective lives. These moments reinforce the importance of boundaries. I could be involved, present, and supportive without assuming responsibilities that were beyond my capacity. I also learned to manage my emotions around her fiancé. His frustration often felt personal, but I reminded myself that it stemmed from his perspective on family roles and caregiving responsibilities. I didn't take his resentment as a reflection of my worth or my love for my mum. It was a reflection of the expectations he held. By separating his perception from my reality, I was able to maintain a sense of equilibrium and ensure that interactions remained respectful and constructive. Another layer of complexity was my own reflection on family dynamics. Watching my mum care for a medically complex child with precision and dedication was both inspiring and intimidating. Her fiancé's children required constant attention, and the environment was one of careful scheduling, vigilance, and empathy. Observing this made me acutely aware of the differences between my life and theirs, reinforcing the importance of boundaries. I wanted to be a part of their lives, yes, but I recognized that involvement didn't have to mean direct caregiving. Present, attention, and emotional support were valid forms of contribution. Maintaining relationships in this context also required communication and negotiation. I had to express my limitations clearly, ensuring that my mum and her fiancé understood my stance without creating unnecessary conflict. This meant repeated conversations, clarifying my intent, and sometimes navigating moments of disappointment or misunderstanding. Each dialogue was an exercise in empathy, patience, and self-awareness, reinforcing the importance of honesty and respect in family dynamics. There were also lessons in patience and adaptability. The household was unpredictable, as any home with young children and medical complexities would be. Plans could change in an instant, routines could be disrupted, and emergencies could arise. I had to remain flexible in my visits, understanding that my time with my mum might be interrupted or limited. This required adjusting expectations, embracing uncertainty, and finding ways to connect meaningfully even within constraints. As time went on, I became more confident in my ability to navigate this blended family dynamic. I understood where I could contribute meaningfully, where my boundaries were non-negotiable, and how to maintain relationships without overextending myself. My mum's support remained unwavering, and while her fiancé's disappointment lingered, I learned to accept it as part of the reality of blended family life. Ultimately, my decision to stay uninvolved in direct caregiving allowed me to maintain a sustainable and authentic relationship with my mum. I could visit, spend quality time, and offer support without stepping into a role I wasn't prepared for. This choice preserved both my mental well-being and the quality of my interactions with my family. I also learned that love and care can manifest in many forms. Presence, empathy, support, and understanding are just as important as direct caregiving responsibilities. Reflecting on the past months, I recognized the growth and self-awareness that came from navigating these dynamics. I learned to balance affection with boundaries, empathy with self-preservation, and presence with respect for complex routines. The experience reinforced the idea that family involvement is multifaceted, that meaningful connections don't always require direct responsibility, and that boundaries are essential for sustainable relationships. While her fiancé may continue to hold a grudge, I am confident in the choices I've made. I am present for my mum, I am engaged in meaningful ways with her family, and I respect both my own limits and the demands of their household. Navigating this new dynamic has been challenging, but it has also been deeply instructive, teaching lessons in empathy, communication, and the nuanced ways that love and support can be expressed. Looking forward, I see a path where I can continue to foster meaningful relationships without compromising my own boundaries. I will continue to visit, support, and engage with my mum on terms that work for both of us. I will respect the complexities of her household while maintaining a healthy sense of self, understanding that my involvement is valuable even if it does not include direct caregiving, and I will carry the lessons learned from these experiences into the future, navigating blended family dynamics with empathy, honesty, and thoughtful boundaries.